thank you. Now we're going to put the spectacles on because the letters are just too small. I want to introduce a very special guest. Many of you already know who Dr. Woods is, some of you don't, and you'll be very impressed tonight, I'm sure. Dr. Woods is a senior fellow of the Ludwig von Mises Institute, and he's the creator of Tom Woods' Liberty Classroom. The Ludwig von Mises Institute is an Austrian economics, sound money part of the Auburn University, and he holds a bachelor's degree in history from Harvard and has a master's and a PhD from Columbia University. He is the author of 11 books, some of them are in the back. Most recently, Rollback, Repealing Big Government Before the Coming Fiscal Collapse, and Nullification, How to Resist Federal Tyranny in the 21st Century. Some of the other books include the New York Times bestsellers Meltdown, A Free Market Look at Why the Stock Market Collapsed, The Economy Tanked, and Government Bailouts Will Make Things Worse. Dr. Woods was asked to speak in front of a congressional committee, and I believe a lot of it had to do with what he spoke about in his book. The Politically Incorrect Guide to American History, as well as my favorite, Who Killed the Constitution? The Fate of American Liberty from World War I to George W. Bush. I think he's ready to start another chapter and talk about Barack Obama. And also 33 questions about American history you're not supposed to ask. Dr. Woods has appeared on CNBC, MSNBC, Fox News, Fox Business, C-SPAN, and Bloomberg Television, among other outlets, and has been a guest on hundreds of radio shows, including National Public Radio, The Dennis Miller Show, The Michael Reagan Show, The Dennis Prager Show, G. Gordon Liddy Show, and The Michael Medved Show. He is a regular fill-in on the Peter Schiff radio show. I would like to join me in welcoming Dr. Thomas Woods.
Back here. I guess I've spoken now. This is the third time I've been in South Carolina speaking, and the other two times were both at Furman University, so not too far from here. And both of those events were sponsored by a group called the Conservative Students for a Better Tomorrow. And I just love that name, because how can you be against that when you're for a worse tomorrow? Gotta love these people. So I'm glad to have another chance to be down here. Now, let me get my watch out so I can keep an eye on this, because I don't want to keep you longer than... Please do. You know. Oh, well, that's very kind of you to say. Thanks. I used to be a college professor. They didn't always feel that way, but it's nice to have you guys here in the audience. All right, I'm going to say some things tonight that are not the sort of things that you would learn in a typical 7th grade class. In fact, I would say probably you can count on one or two hands the number of schools in the whole country that would teach the things I'm going to say. And yet, what I'm going to say is going to take up about as much time as you would spend in one class in a high school in the U.S. And if you were to know these things, you would be able to refute, smash, overturn almost all the propaganda you get about the U.S. Constitution. Now that, I am making you one serious promise there with what I'm about to say. So, hold on, no. Let me deliver first, and then you see what you think. All right, so I want to jump right in, because I actually have a lot of things I want to talk about. There actually is a clock all the way back there, but I think about 20 years ago I would have been able to see that without my glasses. So that's, I'll just keep an eye on the watch here. All right, so I'm going to start at the beginning. And what I'm going to do is, first I'm going to talk about the intentions of the people who were at the Constitutional Convention. I'm going to talk briefly about what actually came out of the Constitutional Convention. I'm then going to talk about major errors that are made very often by high school teachers. Now, honorable exceptions exist right here in this very room. It's not a blanket condemnation of all teachers, just 99.9% of them. Some of the common errors that you see in constitutional interpretation, we'll talk about that. But then also talk about, not just about the federal government and what its powers are. That's sort of my first half. But the second half is the other side of the coin. What is, or what was supposed to be, the role of the states? And that will fill out the second half. And by the time we get done with this, I hope you feel like, I know some of you people these are disproportionately educated people of South Carolina here in this room, so some of you will just be nodding your head going, yeah, I've heard this a million times, but I hope others of you will say, darn it, I can't believe I was so scammed by these people in the media, the professors. And, well, thanks to the internet, we can now get around these gatekeepers of approved opinion and get the reality out there. In fact, I have a book called Nullification, which is an interesting thing to talk about here in South Carolina, by the way, because there's a state that has some guts. But this is the sort of thing that is sort of not talked about in polite society. And that is, this is really the logical consequence of where my argument is going. So in case it's not clear halfway through where I'm heading toward arguing that this idea that the states in the last resort have to have some defense mechanism against the federal government is not some crazy idea that John C. Calhoun thought of one day when he was drunk, or it's not some crazy idea that we came up with in 2008 or 2012. It goes right back to the founding. It goes right back to the framing of the Constitution. But the fact that nullification, before I get started, I do want to point out, the very fact that nullification is now being talked about is itself a testimony to the power of the internet. Because this is an issue and a topic that is not touched by the mainstream media at all. And it's not even touched by right-wing radio that considers itself so cheeky and patriotic and, oh, we're outside the bounds, saying things that are forbidden. Not really. I've never heard Sean Hannity talk about nullification. I've never heard Rush Limbaugh talk about nullification. I've heard his fill-in host, Walter Williams, talk about nullification, because he actually has some guts. But most of these people are asleep at the wheel when it comes to this. So how has it gotten out? It's only because of the internet. Now, there has been some complaint that how come people weren't talking nullification when Bill Clinton was in power? It's only when Obama's in power that now the evil right wing wants to talk nullification. We all know the real reason for this. It's because we're all racists. It was okay when a white guy was oppressing us and doing all kinds of terrible things. But Obama, that's just the last straw. No, of course, the difference is that in the 1990s, we barely had a functioning internet. And so, sure, nobody even knows this is an option. And now suddenly, it's creeping up all over the place. All right, so let's start at the beginning. Let's go to the Constitutional Convention. There are basically three groups that you can identify at the Constitutional Convention. And these three groups were identified for us by Luther Martin of Maryland. And he said, going into the convention, you had three different groups of people, three different agendas. One, the most extreme, you might call the monarchist faction. And we associate this with Alexander Hamilton. And these were people who wanted to obliterate the states altogether and have simply one unitary government. Hamilton was notoriously, in fact, one might say, suicidally frank in his description of his own preferred system. He said that he believed that the British government was the best and most illustrious in the world. This doesn't go over too well with people who just fought a war against them because they were being oppressed by it. But that's, that's Hamilton. This would be, today, the newspapers today, this would be called a gaffe, that Hamilton did this. But then he goes on and says that what he favors is a president who would serve for life, senators who would serve for life, and then all the governors would be appointed by the president. So the states would be simply administrative units of the Senate. They wouldn't actually have any lives of their own. So, okay, that was Hamilton. He also noted that he was a little bit out of step with the rest of the convention. Well, you don't say. So that's the first group. The second group we might call the nationalists, who don't have any sympathy for a monarchical system or don't, by and large, share Hamilton's enthusiasm for the British system, but nevertheless, they want as much centralization of power in Washington as they think they can get away with by means of the convention. And then finally, the third group. This is a group that does want to strengthen the center to some degree, to rectify perceived imperfections in the Articles of Confederation. But other than that, they want to reaffirm the primacy of the states as the primary political units of the United States. And so in other words, what they want is what we would call a federal system. That's what that third group wants. Well, ultimately, the third group wins. The third group is victorious. And you can tell by just reading the Constitution. It does not contain the things that the nationalists were calling for. It obviously doesn't contain what Alexander Hamilton was calling for. But it also does not contain what the nationalists wanted, which was a national government with general legislative authority, which simply means they wanted a government that could just do whatever it wanted on a whole host of subjects. It could just do what it wanted. We don't have that. We have a government of enumerated powers, not a government that can just do whatever it wants. Now, I know you're saying, but our government does do whatever it wants. Well, you're getting a little bit ahead of my story, see. So the point is that nationalists lose. The things they wanted do not pass. A national, federal government veto over state laws, that's nowhere in the Constitution. So the Federalists, lowercase f, the people who favor a federal system, a decentralized system, are victorious, and it's in the state ratifying conventions that we particularly see this emphasized. Each state had to decide for itself whether or not to ratify the Constitution in its own special convention elected for this purpose. And in these conventions, the meaning of the Constitution was explained to the public. And in there it was repeatedly urged that this document is not intended to establish a government that would have plenary authority over everything. That we specifically inserted these clauses in here that narrow down its focus. And we've got Article 1, Section 8 that tells you it can only do these things. And this appears in one after the other of these ratifying conventions. And it's there that you look to find out what the Constitution means. You actually don't primarily go to the Constitutional Convention to find out what the Constitution means. And that may seem a little bit odd. You would think, go to the source. But remember, the Constitutional Convention was held behind closed doors. The media was not allowed in. People did not know what was being discussed. And only decades later did people's notes and minutes come out of the convention. So the public cannot be expected to be bound by the meanings of phrases that were debated in secret. What they're bound by is the way the Constitution was actually pitched to them in the ratifying conventions. And that's why Madison said, James Madison, if you want to know what the Constitution means, you look to the state ratifying conventions. And in those conventions, as I say, one after the other, is constant emphasis on the federal nature of the system that was created. All right, now, even though the nationalists lose, they're down, but they're not out. Because what they're going to try to do over time is take the federal system that was created and then just simply dishonestly interpret it so that it kind of comes out the way they wanted it to originally. And the way they do that is by means of several constitutional clauses that, since the drafting of the Constitution, have been expanded in meaning to the point where they would not even have been recognized by the people who drafted them originally. So, for example, a lot of times you will hear the General Welfare Clause referred to. Now, general welfare appears in Article 1 and also in the preamble. Now, for the preamble, we can dismiss that right away, because a preamble is merely declaratory of what a document intends to do. A preamble is not legally binding. This was absolutely common legal principle everywhere in the world in the 18th century. So the preamble is of no legal significance. It's of rhetorical significance. It declares the intent, but that's all it does. But, so when we see general welfare later, what does it mean? Well, we can figure out what it doesn't mean. It doesn't mean whatever the government thinks will be for your welfare, it can go ahead and do. It absolutely does not mean that, but that's what your teacher tells you it means. That's what your next door neighbor thinks it means. It's what the people blabbing at you on television think it means, because they just pick up the document and they say general welfare. Well, that sounds to me like welfare payments. Sounds to me like agricultural subsidies. Sounds to me like the space program. Sounds to me, and it's just a big long list of things that it absolutely isn't. So what in fact is it? Well, we look at it closely. We see that the general welfare, in fact, is referred to in these ratifying conventions. and it is referred to by Madison, by Jefferson, repeatedly. And in these references, it is described to us as a phrase that, well, possibly limits what the federal government can do, in the sense that it can do things only with an eye to the general welfare, as opposed to favoring the particular sectional welfare of one part of the country or another. We also know that it cannot be a plenary grant of authority. We know that because there is no plenary grant of authority. Any such clause was immediately voted down. A guy named Gunning Bedford tried to insert a clause that would basically say that would be an elastic clause, the whatever you want to do clause, and this didn't even get a second in the convention. But also, Madison just made the common sense point. If this clause means the government can do anything it wants to, if it thinks that it's for your own good, well, look, every dictator in the world says that. Sure, the things that, yeah, I'm jailing these people because it's for your own good. I'm jailing you because it's for your own good. I mean, come on. But also, he says, if we list in this document the specific things the federal government can do, then wouldn't it be a little bit ridiculous to say, all right, here are the specific things that you are allowed to do, plus anything else you want? It would make the listing of it absurd. And one rule of thumb when interpreting the Constitution, according to Jefferson, and really according to any sound principle of textual interpretation, is that no clause can be interpreted in a way that would render the rest of the document unnecessary. So if you interpret this clause to mean go ahead and do anything you want, then why have a Constitution? So this can't be right. And Madison insisted on this over and over, I mean, throughout his career. As inconsistent as he could be on some things, on the General Welfare Clause, he was like a laser beam his whole career. And he said, for instance, shortly after the ratification of the Constitution, and around the time of the ratification, we had a lot of suggestions coming from the states for amendments to the Constitution. Well, the Constitution needs a Bill of Rights, it needs this amendment, it needs that amendment. And he says, but you know what's interesting? Not one amendment came forward from the states saying, we have to limit the General Welfare Clause. And he said, now, if the General Welfare Clause was really intended to mean what these crazies say it is, then it is far more dangerous than any of the other things the states were worried about, and yet not one of them complained about it, because they all knew what the real meaning was. Now, the only argument that you can make against this that I can see is that Alexander Hamilton had a different view of the General Welfare Clause from Madison and Jefferson. He had a much more expansive view of what it allowed the federal government to do, and that is true. But note this, before the Constitution was ratified, and at the time Hamilton wants people to ratify it, because he figures it's the best he's going to get, so he'll go ahead, it's better than nothing. At that time, he was downplaying the significance of the General Welfare Clause. He says, oh, for example, he said that agriculture couldn't be touched by the federal government under the General Welfare Clause. That has nothing to do with it. No. There's no power over agriculture. Envisioned because of that clause. And then as soon as the Constitution is ratified, he turns around and says, well, you know, the federal government could get involved in agriculture thanks to the General Welfare Clause. Well, okay, so now he's taken two different positions on this. Well, to my mind, which of these positions should command our assent? Now, which of these positions seems more plausible? The one that he's presenting to the public at the time that they actually have a choice in the matter, when they're deciding over the Constitution and they're debating it, or the interpretation he comes up with conveniently afterward when the thing is already passed and people are stuck with it? Well, you know, and then also, again, when we consider how far out of bounds Hamilton was considered by practically everyone, then I think we can judge for ourselves the real significance of his view of the General Welfare Clause. So the General Welfare Clause simply means that when the federal government is carrying out the powers assigned to it, it does so with an eye to the general welfare. It does not mean that it now has an additional 800,000 supplementary powers. It does not mean that. No one ever said that it meant that. No ratifying convention was told that it would mean that. The Commerce Clause is another one. The federal government can regulate interstate commerce. This one we can take all night on, so I'm going to actually take the least time on this. I talked about all these clauses in nullification. But the long and the short of the Commerce Clause is that Madison's view was that for the most part the Commerce Clause was really pointing to a negative power. That this was to make sure that the states did not erect obstacles to the free flow of commerce from one state to another. So we want to regulate interstate commerce. We want to make interstate commerce flow smoothly across the country. It certainly did not mean what it is taken to mean today, which is the federal government can regulate anything at all that even remotely affects another state. It could not mean that. It was not intended to mean that. There's no evidence in the ratifying conventions that it means that. But today, for example, in the 20th century and the 21st century, we have this view, I think, exemplified best in a case some of you know, 1942, Wickard versus Philburg. You know that case where there's this farmer and he's growing wheat on his own land, and he's consuming it, and his livestock is consuming it. And he's told the federal government can regulate him, and he says, I don't think you can. Because I don't see that I'm engaged in interstate commerce. My consuming my own wheat does not affect another state, because that was the new version of the Interstate Commerce Clause. If you're doing something that affects another state, we can come in there and regulate you. And he said, look, that's probably a crazy idea too, but the point is I'm not even doing that. I'm just consuming wheat. But the answer came back, aha, but you see, if you didn't consume that wheat, there's a chance you might have bought wheat from another state. So by consuming your own wheat, and abstaining from buying wheat from another state, you are affecting interstate commerce, and therefore you're doing something we can regulate. So you see why the framers didn't say that anything that might affect another state, the federal government can go and regulate, because of course that would mean the federal government could regulate everything, because conceivably everything affects another state. Because if not doing something affects another state, then everything, arguing could have. I mean, I've sometimes thought we better really be careful about how we argue. Sometimes we argue with the reductio ad absurdum, where you take an argument to some crazy extreme to show that it must be a false argument, because if you follow the logical conclusion of it, it leads to this absurdity. The problem is when you do that with the federal government, they're happy to embrace the absurdity. So I've sometimes said, you know what would affect interstate commerce is having families. The more children you have, the more production they're going to do, and so therefore the more goods that are going to flow from one state to another. So therefore, why couldn't the federal government regulate the number of children you could have? But you know what? I don't dare say it. I mean, there's nothing you could say that they wouldn't say, well, you know, maybe there's some circumstances. So again, this is where we've gone. But this wasn't what people thought they were getting into at the time. No one would have ratified a document like that, because again, conceivably anything could come under the purview of the federal government under that interpretation. And then finally, the one that the social studies teacher loves the best, the alleged elastic clause. Well, there is no elastic clause, but this is the one they're thinking of is the necessary and proper clause. It says the federal government will have these powers that are necessary and proper to carry the foregoing powers into execution. So that is to say, in Article 1, Section 8, we list the things the federal government can do. The necessary and proper clause says the federal government also has whatever powers are necessary to carry those powers out. So, for example, to erect needful buildings is one of the enumerated powers. So, according to the necessary and proper clause, that would also imply a power to go out and buy lumber to build the needful buildings. But that's it. It doesn't mean that, therefore, it can do anything at all. It can do things that are necessary and proper for carrying out one of these enumerated powers. That's all it means. And again, in the ratifying conventions, that's what people were told. In the Virginia Ratifying Convention, Madison said this, it gives the federal government no supplementary power. George Nicholas, who became the first Attorney General of Kentucky, says it does not give any additional power to the federal government. In the North Carolina Convention, Archibald McLean says it gives no additional power to the federal government. And this just went on and on and on, example after example. Even Alexander Hamilton himself, who wants the federal government to have all these extra powers, even he admitted, he said the Constitution would be exactly the same if this clause were absolutely obliterated. It is merely clarifying the fact, which would have been taken for granted anyway, even if it did not exist, that if the federal government is given a power, and there's something that it has to do to carry out that power, it can do that thing. That's it. That's what these things mean. All right, so there's some stuff about what the Constitution wound up looking like. The three different groups going into it, and then what it actually wound up looking like. It looked like what the third group wanted, the Federalists. And when I say Federalists, I'm using a different sense from what your textbook would use. The Federalist Party in the early 1790s, and also the Federalists at the time of the Constitution. These were people who supported the Constitution, and a lot of them, some of them did favor a stronger central government. When I use the term Federalists, I mean supporters of the idea of federalism, of a decentralized system where there's some power at the center, but most power is reserved at the periphery in the states. All right, so now we've looked a little bit at the federal government in different ways that have been tried to persuade us that the federal government has more power than actually it was intended to have. All right, so now the other side of this coin is the states. Now, one interesting thing you notice if you read the Constitution is that every time the term United States is used, the United States is always, every time in the Constitution, always referred to in the plural. The United States are. It is never, in the Constitution, never referred to as the United States is. And in this place, no, it's these states, the United States are. Now that you may think that's just sort of an archaic usage, maybe it has no significance, but it does have significance. And to assess that significance, let's go back to the Declaration of Independence, because there, the states are also referred to in the plural. These states have complaints in the Declaration of Independence. We are free and independent states, says the Declaration of Independence. And when they say states, they don't mean like what we think of as states today. When we think of states, we think of Massachusetts. Well, maybe in South Carolina you don't think of Massachusetts, but I talk about Massachusetts. You know, Vermont, South Carolina, Texas, whatever. But when they were talking about states in 1776, they meant states like nation states. They meant like what we would today recognize as a country. They meant like Spain. They meant France. They meant England. They meant places like that. We are free and independent states, just like Spain or Italy. I mean, there was no United Italy at that time. It's a sort of anachronistic example, but you understand my point. That's the sense in which they meant we are free and independent states. And we can do all those things that sovereign states can of right do, and they list them. We can make war and all these other things. So they are states. They are to be referred to in the plural. Then we look at the diplomatic language used in treaties that the states entered into. First the colonies and then states. So for example, the treaty with France says, hey, the King of France is entering into an agreement with the United States, which are, and then they list them. It wasn't, we're entering into an agreement with the United States, a great big country. It was not that. We're entering into an agreement with these 13 places. Same thing is evident in the agreement between the States General of the Netherlands and the states in 1782. The States General of the Netherlands enters into this agreement with the 13 United States. Not with the United States, not with one place, but with the 13 United States. Same thing with the treaty with Sweden the following year, 1783. King of Sweden has entered into an agreement with these 13 states. Also 1783, the Treaty of Paris, ending the war for independence. There again, the states are listed one by one. The King of England acknowledges the independence of the United States, which, by the way, happen to be the following places, and then they're all listed. Okay, so that's of some significance. The Articles of Confederation, you'll know the document that precedes the Constitution. 1781 is ratified. Article 2 says, among other things, the states retain their sovereignty, freedom, and independence. Now, obviously, the states would have to have been sovereign in advance for them to retain their sovereignty in 1781. So far, again, we see the emphasis on the states as being a bunch of places. It's not one giant blob, it's a bunch of places. Now, this is a point that may seem pedantic, insignificant. It's not. And it is certainly not a point that is being emphasized in classrooms around the country. There's just nothing about this. And finally, we get to the Constitution. How is the Constitution ratified? Did we have one giant vote of all the people? No, it went from one state to another, to another, to another. It was ratified by one at a time, emphasizing that the primordial unit of the United States is the state. It is not just a random bunch of individuals. It is a collection of societies that makes up the United States. Now, you may say, but once the states enter the United States, surely they give up some of their sovereignty. Now we have a system of divided sovereignty. I don't think that's the case. First of all, let's clarify what we mean by state sovereignty. This is a shorthand term that we use. But strictly speaking, in the American system, no government is thought to be sovereign. Sovereignty means that you have the final say. There's nobody above you. So when we say the United States government today is sovereign, we mean that the United Nations can't tell it what to do. The United States, in its own borders, is the final word. That's what sovereignty is all about. Well, we don't say that the state governments are sovereign. Heaven help us. Who would want to think that the state of Maryland, I mean, just to pick a particularly horrific Marxist example, is sovereign? No. The idea is that the peoples of the states are sovereign. The peoples of the states are the people of South Carolina, the people of Maryland. These peoples are sovereign. And that in their sovereign capacity, they apportion their sovereignty by granting some powers, delegating some powers to the state government, and then some powers by the states are delegated to the federal government. But the sovereignty ultimately resides in the people and can be resumed by them. So it is not that, so when we say state sovereignty, we really mean the sovereignty of the people of the state. But that's kind of clunky and awkward, so we don't put it that way. So that's what we mean by state sovereignty. But as I say, people may think that when they ratified the Constitution, though, and they entered the United States, that surely some sovereignty is being given up somewhere. But as I say, I don't believe this is the case. What's actually going on is that the sovereign people are saying, we delegate to this institution, the United States of America, authority over these various areas. However, we are still the sovereigns. And if this doesn't work out, we could still pull these things back because we are the sovereigns. If the United States government was the sovereign, we could never pull it back from them. But we can. And in fact, given that the states, the peoples of the states started off as the sovereigns, well, sovereignty is something that once you have it, you can't give it up. I mean, people could try and take it from you. People could conquer you and say, well, try and assert your sovereignty now, but might doesn't make right. Technically, you're still sovereign. And likewise with the Constitution. Let me read you just a little passage from what international law at the time took for granted about what happens when sovereign bodies enter into confederations like the Constitution. This is from Emmerich de Vattel, who was one of the great 18th century international lawyers, in his book, The Law of Nations. He says, several sovereign and independent states may unite themselves together by a perpetual confederacy without ceasing to be, each individually, a perfect state. They will together constitute a federal republic. Their joint deliberations will not impair the sovereignty of each member, though they may, in certain respects, put some restraint on the exercise of it in virtue of voluntary engagements. So the states may voluntarily, the peoples of the states may voluntarily say, for the sake of the common good, we voluntarily agree to refrain from exercising such and such power and to delegate that power to the United States. That doesn't mean they're any less sovereign. That's one of the things sovereigns do, is they delegate powers, but they still remain sovereign ultimately. And so now we understand why the United States appears in the plural in the Constitution, because that's what this whole thing is all about. Now, one objection that may still linger in your mind is, well, you have a textual problem here because the Constitution, after all, does begin, we the people. And you're saying that the Constitution is establishing a system based on the states, and the states are the main unit, and it starts off with we the people? Try explaining that one, smart guy. And the answer to that is that originally, it did say we the states. That was how it was originally written. We the states of, and then you go on and list them. And then it comes out of the Committee on Style, which obviously the Committee on Style is not empowered to make substantive changes to the document. It comes out of the Committee on Style, we the people. Now why is that? Well, it seems likely that the reason for this is that obviously before the Constitution is ratified, you can't know which states are going to ratify it. You can't say we the people of New Hampshire if you don't know if New Hampshire is going to approve it. You can't say we the people of Massachusetts, likewise. You can't say these things unless you know, and you don't know yet. So we the people, given everything I've described, the people means the peoples of the states. And this we know from the notes of the convention. We actually now know this, that this is what happened. And this change was accepted without debate. And so this change was actually meant to change the Constitution from a federal document to a document establishing a single unitary government ruling over the whole country. It seems highly unlikely this would have been accepted without any debate whatsoever, given that was the whole debate that was going on at the time. All right, so what is the significance of this? Why am I harping on this? Why does this matter? Well, it matters because it indicates who is ultimately in charge of this thing. It is not the Supreme Court that's ultimately in charge of this thing. given that the states, the peoples who lived there, got the ball rolling. They were there even before there was a Supreme Court. Believe it or not, there was something that existed before the Supreme Court. And it was the states and the people who reside there. They are the ultimate last resort. And so this is where now I want to say a little something about this forbidden topic. I'll just remind you, just by picking up a title at random here, okay, nullification. Because now we see that the idea of nullification follows logically from everything I've just said. Because the idea of it is that a nullifying state, a state that says we are not going to do what the federal government is telling us to do because it's unconstitutional. A nullifying state that's doing that understands what I've just described here tonight. That we are the units of this republic. And so we have to have some say in what happens here. Because there is no condition in which the agent gets to decide for the principal what a contract means. So if I have an agent, I have a literary agent, and I delegate to him authority to negotiate on my behalf. But he doesn't just come up with a whole bunch of other powers on his own, like, hey, I also decided what your menu for today is going to be. He's just my agent. I'm the principal. So he only does the things that I tell him he can do. Well, likewise, the states are obviously the principals, because they were here first. And the federal government that they created is their agent. And so if that federal government now orders them to do things that they never authorized it to do, what are they supposed to say? Well, hey, after all, you're the agent. No one would do that. I mean, no employer, when an employee comes up and says, look, you're running this place all wrong. It's starting tomorrow. There's going to be some changes around here. No employer would tolerate this. Wait, you're the employee. You don't tell me what to do. Well, likewise with the federal government and the states. And the concern that Jefferson had was that if the federal government, heaven forbid, ever acquires a monopoly on interpreting the Constitution, we all know what's going to happen. It will interpret the Constitution in its own favor and constantly be acquiring more and more powers and discovering more and more powers every day. So we don't want that to happen. And so what we have then is what I'm sure practically everybody in this room knows about the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions of 1798, where Jefferson and Madison laid out that the states, that the federal government is limited. It's got only the powers listed in the Constitution. We got the 10th Amendment, and if the federal government goes beyond that, beyond those powers, then the states have to refuse to do it. And Jefferson even used the word nullification. A nullification is the rightful remedy, Jefferson said. That's what needs to be done. And then, some of the other states griped about this. Who are Virginia and Kentucky to do this? Who do they think they are? Virginia and Kentucky were upset about some legislation, particularly the Sedition Act, which penalized unkind speech toward the U.S. President and the Congress. And a lot of these other states, like the New England states, the crummy New England states liked the Sedition Act. So of course they didn't want Virginia and Kentucky to say, now wait a minute, the states can refuse to abide by this. New England called the Sedition Act wise. It's a wise piece of legislation that you should be thrown in jail for making a crack about John Adams. So Virginia and Kentucky did stand up, and other states did gripe, and we don't like it. So James Madison wrote his famous report of 1800. He thought, well, we got all this criticism of what we just said, so let me go back and look at it. We're going to look at it. Maybe we were hasty. Let's go back and look at what we just said. When we said that the states, in the last resort, have to be able to resist the federal government. Let's go back and look, and maybe we were wrong. No, to the contrary, in the report of 1800, he says, well, you know what, we looked at, I think we're going to stay put, stand pat on what we originally said. And he emphasizes there that there has to be, that it's not that the president is infallible, or it's not that the president is crummy and the congressmen are crummy, but our judges come from heaven itself. All men are fallible, and all the three of the branches are fallible. And so Madison said in the report of 1800 that there has to be the very logic of the system. The states created this thing to benefit them. The logic of this thing demands that if this thing turns against them, and all three branches betray them, even the hallowed judicial branch, before whom we're not worthy to stand, and we're supposed to wave incense in front of them, if even they betray us, then we have to say the states, as a last resort mechanism to save the very system they created, have to be able to say no. He said that in the report of 1800. And incidentally, in the following decade, the very New England states that were griping and lecturing Virginia and Kentucky for being unpatriotic, for not agreeing to throw journalists and congressmen in jail for criticizing the president, all of a sudden, 10 years later, when the shoe's on the other foot and the federal government is oppressing them, oh, they can't talk about nullification enough. Oh my gosh, blah, 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 blah. Can you imagine that? Some people don't have principles. It just matters whose ox is being gored. How do you like that? There are some people in the world like that. And so all of a sudden now in New England, yeah, they're all in favor of it. They can't talk about it enough. In 1809, the governor of Connecticut said that the state governments are not just here to look nice. They are here to stand between the people of that state and the federal government. If the federal government ever leaps beyond its constitutional bounds, it is the role of the states to stand up and stop that. Whoa, that was Connecticut. Connecticut! My gosh, could you imagine Connecticut saying anything of any significance on any topic whatsoever today? Much less anything like that? And that was normal. Like, people talked like that. People talked like that in the old days. What's funny, by the way, is that 2 years ago, there was a race for Attorney General of Connecticut. And a woman named Martha Dean was running as a Republican in Connecticut. And she ran on a nullification ticket. She came right out and said we should nullify laws that are unconstitutional. And she got up there in the debate, and I'm not kidding you. Now look, I'm not saying I recommend this. So if you're going into office, I don't necessarily recommend this. In the debate, she holds up my book, starts reading from it. She starts reading what the governor of Connecticut had said 200 years earlier. And she basically said, now, why don't we have that kind of courage today? Now, that blew the media away. Like, the first response of the media was, and then it was immediately destroy mode. Destroy, destroy, destroy. This woman has strayed from what is allowable to say in this free country. She's not allowed to say that. She's supposed to get up there and say, well, you know, whatever the government tells us to do, we'll just go along with it. Now vote for me. And she didn't say that. So she probably supports slavery. I mean, like, that's the level of debate. She probably supports slavery. Yeah, I think that's a reasonable person would conclude that. It couldn't be that she just happens to have a different interpretation of the Constitution from you. These people are incapable of having a fair argument. Incapable. Cannot have it. Impossible. It is not in their Constitution, so to speak, to do that. Now, she didn't win. And I wrote to her, I apologized. I said, now, if I caused you any grief, you know, like indirectly or something, I'm sorry. And she said, no, I wouldn't do anything differently. We've got to get these issues talked about. Because the first stage is going to be demonize everybody who talks about this. Demonize, demonize, slavery, 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 demonize. But if enough people talk about it, eventually you can't just keep saying that. Like, at some point, you are going to actually have to make an argument. And people like that are helping to bring this about. And that's good, because I'm sort of the opinion that if we just do the same old thing that we've been trying, well, if we just vote for Lindsey Graham again, things will improve. That was a low blow down here in South Carolina. But I come from the land of Ted Kennedy. You've got to let me joke about somebody else's senator once in a while. All right. Now, I'm going to digress for one moment, because maybe some of you haven't seen this. Is there anybody in this room who has seen my interview with a zombie? Okay, a handful. All right, well then I got to tell the rest of you guys about this, and I hope you guys just stand pat for 1 minute. When you write a book called Nullification, you know what's going to happen to you in advance. And I want to sum up the deeply intellectual arguments that confronted me when the book came out. Okay, you ready? I mean, these were arguments that obviously had been worked on for a long time by serious scholars and heavily footnoted. And the arguments that were advanced against me ran something like this. Slavery, 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 racism, 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 slavery, slavery, slavery. So now I knew that that was going to happen. I knew that debate in this country takes place in a 2-inch range here, a little spectrum about that wide, and nullification is like way over there, so it's not in this, you know. How do you want the federal government to screw you? Do you want it to screw you this way or that way? Like, that's the sort of argument that the New York Times allows us to have. So when we say, well, I don't think they should do it at all, well, oh my gosh, you're so dangerous, you probably want slavery. No, they don't actually think I want slavery. Okay, I mean, they're not that stupid. You know, they're sinister, but they're not stupid. They don't actually think I want slavery. They just want to demonize me, obviously. Just get people not listening to me. Oh, I heard that guy wants slavery. There's no evidence for this, right? Why would I? Anyway, so what I did was I thought, well, before they have a chance to do this, I'm already going to start laughing at them. Before this, I know they're going to do it. I know they're going to walk right into my trap. So why don't I lay the trap? The trap was a little video I made called Interview with a Zombie. Now, I made this. It's like an 8-minute video. It should have been 4 minutes. It's too long. That is the problem. But it's had, like, I don't know, 130,000 views. That's pretty good on YouTube. And the premise of the video is this. There's a zombie, and he has his own television talk show. And he interviews authors. And I go on, and I'm going to talk about nullification. Now, the zombie and I, the zombie is actually a really smart PhD economist friend of mine, who just has no shame whatsoever and no professional future anymore, as it turns out. But we decided arbitrarily, the zombie can say only one word at a time. And the idea of it is that no matter how substantive my answers are, the zombie simply continues to say the politically correct words, demonizing words, over and over and over. And I keep refuting them, and he keeps saying them. And I just keep on refuting them, and he just keeps saying them. So every day he'll say, slavery. And I'll say, well, you know, what's actually interesting about nullification is that it was never actually used on behalf of slavery, given, you know, there weren't any anti-slavery laws to nullify, so how could it have been used that way? But actually it was used to fight against some of the fugitive slave legislation. Oh, this just blows the zombie away. So I actually say, you know, I actually say, actually nullification was never used on behalf of slavery, but you know what it was used on behalf of? And he says, slavery? I mean, like, he still can't bring out. So the idea of the video is, the implicit idea, is that this is exactly what an interview with Rachel Maddow or Chris Matthews would look like. It would be exactly that. Except they're not the undead, though. This guy's an actual zombie. And he's doing the same interview they would do. No matter what, I said, no matter the voluminous evidence that I bring forth. So what I want you to do, your mission statement, or your mission tonight from me, is I'd like you to watch this video for me. And you can watch it easily by going to, I bought the domain name, interviewwithazombie.com. Yeah, oh yeah. That was right for the picking, baby. Interviewwithazombie.com. And then also, underneath that is the blooper tape. Because believe it or not, it's hard to keep a straight face when you're talking to a guy dressed up as a zombie. And so I don't know how we got through. The blooper tape is actually much funnier than the actual video. And then beneath it, somebody actually made up zombie gear. Like you can get a t-shirt, a mug, or a mouse pad. Like if you really like the video, I don't get any money from that. That is something that's not connected to me at all. Some great entrepreneur thought that up. I do have the t-shirt, by the way, which I wear around the house. It scares my children a little bit. Big zombie on the shirt. But anyway, let's get back to this. I just wanted to tell you that because it just goes to show that in the age of the internet, though, it's harder for them to smear you. Because you can come up with clever little workarounds like that. And so now every time there was an article written about me that called me one of these names, you could count on it. In the comments section, somebody always linked to Interview with a Zombie. And they would say, hey, you zombie, why don't you make an actual argument for a change instead of using all these PC words? And these people don't know what hit them. What are you calling me? What, a zombie? It's great. It's beautiful. It's beautiful. So this went better than I could possibly have asked for. Pretty much. All right. So fine, now just to wrap things up. Pretty much what I've been doing since 2004 is I've had a very, very enjoyable career overturning myths, right? Overturning things that I was forced to endure when I was in school. And it all got started in 2004. Regnery Publishing, which has been around since 1947, 1947, I think. 1947. Regnery Publishing has published a a lot of conservatives over the years, and some libertarians. And they come to me and said, how would you like to write a book called The Politically Incorrect Guide to American History? I said, would I? That's great. Like, people think I thought up that title. I don't have that kind of marketing genius. I only wish I did. I come up with an idea that good like once every 11 years. I would never. Like, my book on nullification was my good idea for the decade. So that was come up with by somebody else, The Incorrect Guide to American History. But Politically Incorrect Guide to American History, and now that did well. So now Gregory has a whole series, The Politically Incorrect Guide to X, Y, or Z. They've got at least 12 of them now, and it's really great. And I always joke with those authors. I say, good thing for you guys that my book didn't bomb. I never really done this series, but yeah, it actually did well. I was very happy about that. But that's the sort of thing where I had written a couple of books before The Politically Incorrect Guide. And they were more scholarly books, you know, mainly like written for, that other professors would read. And you write those books not so much for the sales as for the, you know, intellectual satisfaction. And then this Politically Incorrect Guide to American History came out, and it just sold like crazy. And again, I'm convinced it's the title. It just sold, and I got to do some good media for it. But immediately, the thought controllers went into overdrive against me. The New York Times attacked me, not in the book review section, but on the editorial page. It is dangerous that I am peddling this version of American history, where the centralization of power in Washington is not the great progressive force for all time. Oh my gosh, people might question their wise overlords if they read this book. And notice, in that article, when they went after me, they never tried to refute one of my arguments. Same thing with nullification. They don't try to refute you. And by the way, I'd love to see them try to refute me on nullification. They don't even try. But they don't even try. All they say is, can you believe he said this? And can you believe he said that? Well, yeah, as a matter of fact, I can believe it. And I can defend both of those statements. So what is the problem here? It's the fact that you stray is what's dangerous to these people. But then with that and nullification, whatever, well, I've been having a great old time. But you know what? I wish I could go out of business. I would gladly, if the minimum wage hadn't already eliminated all the gas pumping jobs, I would gladly pump gas in a free society where people had the truth. I would gladly do that and give this up if we could just get the information out there. But until that time, this is what I've been doing, and I've been enjoying doing it. Partly because I'm very interested in history, I enjoy writing, and I enjoy driving these gatekeepers of approved opinion crazy. My ultimate message about the United States, when we look at U.S. history, my ultimate message is, we talk a lot about how great the United States is. It's the greatest country in the world. It's got a special destiny in the world. It's unique. It's special. And we talk a lot about the greatness of the United States, but I think a lot of people who say those things are sometimes hard-pressed to identify... Wait, did I lose it? Oh no, the conspiracy extends even to boiling springs!
Come on down here.
No, is this out? Is this really out?
It may have been off balance. She's supposed to have another one for us.
All right, hold on. Yeah. No, this is too important not to get this cat. I'm about to tell you what's so great about America, for heaven's sake, right? Because I'm sure you're all scratching their head at you. What is so great? I'm going to wait for this guy to come out. Talk amongst yourselves. I'm still talking to this thing. It's not even working. All right. Okay. Gosh, you guys are all waiting with bated breath. What is he going to close with this thing about America? Oh, really? So you were accused of being the zombie? No, those people are the zombies. All right, there you go. Okay. All right. Well, wait a minute. Maybe I'll just shout it to you.
That's good.
Okay, and we'll cut off, maybe, because when people clapped after that other part, we'll just cut the video there, okay? And this will be the special part that only the people who showed up in person get to hear. All right? All right. Oh, is she?
Yeah, she's bringing us another microphone.
Oh, yeah, where? From where? Well, maybe we'll save the microphone for the question and answer period,
okay.
And I'll just finish the... All right. So basically, the long and the short of it is, the most unique thing about the United States is precisely this federal decentralist system. Because at the time, the world was starting to move in a direction of centralized governments.
where it's one government and there's a unitary system and it just barks out commands at everybody. And the U.S. was trying to block that. The U.S. was standing in the way of the victory of the French Revolutionary style state all over the world, where there's just one source of authority and it just tells everybody what to do. But in the U.S. we have the states, and we have a collection of societies, and power is dispersed. And we weren't supposed to have one single solitary power center with all the power. And in fact, the 20th century showed us what happens when you have that. Every modern political philosopher says the only way you can organize society is you have one giant central power with all the powers, and everybody else just shuts up and takes it. And there's no subsidiary group or power that can resist it. All right, let's see.
All right, good. Yeah. All right. That's what has swept the world. Like, every country looks like this. France looks like this, Italy looks like this, Japan looks like this. Every country you can think of, practically, is a centralized state. And in the 20th century, what did that make possible? It made possible the worst atrocities in the history of the world. Because there were no subsidiary power centers that could challenge the center. The center absorbed everything. These governments got away with policies that no monarch could ever have gotten away with, because power was far too dispersed and held among too many competing groups. But this was thought of as being stupid and backward and inefficient, and the progressive way forward is to sweep all this aside and have one super-duper efficient central authority ruling over everything. And the wreckage is in the form of hundreds of millions of corpses. Well, nice job, geniuses. Meanwhile, the United States was the great example against this, a great moral example to the world of how society can be organized without such a lethal institution in place. And yet, this has been allowed to slip out of our fingers. That moral example to the world no longer exists because the United States now is simply copying, it has simply contented itself with being just like all the other countries. But I thought the United States, I hear all the time, it's supposed to be different and unique. Well, then let's be different and unique and stand up to the whole rest of the world and say, you can have your bloated leviathans. We are going to have our decentralized republic. All right.